Right. Dr. Scott Sherr, you've been on this channel a lot, always talking about interesting, different neurochemistry, neuroscience. There's an interesting new mushroom compound that's starting to be talked about quite a bit more. It's wild what it does and where it comes from. And I'll just kind of let you take it away because I think people on this channel really like to know the mechanisms and the scientific, like why of what's going on in the brain and what's happening.
Yeah, so it's a good time of year to talk about Christmas, right? And this particular compound comes from a mushroom called the Amanita muscaria mushroom. The Amanita mushroom has been around in folklore in thousands of years ago in places like Northern Europe, especially Siberia, because this mushroom, the Amanita muscaria mushroom, is a psychedelic mushroom that has amazing effects overall. And it was used in shamanic ceremonies back thousands of years ago. And some of the mythology around Christmas is around this mushroom itself, actually. So the red and white cap of this mushroom is iconic, right? So if you know from there's lots of different ways that people know about this mushroom in Alice in Wonderland, Super Mario Brothers. In Christmas itself, the red and white is thought to be from this mushroom itself, actually. So back in the day, and there's tons of people can listen to this online and lots of different movies and shows and documentaries about how they think this mushroom kind of played into the Christmas lore. But the cool thing about this mushroom is it has two different compounds in it. One's called Agarin, another one's called ibotenic acid. And so ibotenic acid is actually a prodrug of Agarin, which what that means is that when you dry the mushroom, which is what they used to do, they actually used to dry this mushroom, put it on pine trees and put it in your home. This is what they did in northern Siberia, many thousands of years ago, and still actually do in Siberian tribes still now. But so your pine tree that you take home for Christmas and put in your house used to be adorned with these mushrooms, actually back in the Siberian areas. It's crazy. So, but the ibotenic acid is the one that causes the psychedelic experience. It's mildly neurotoxic. If the mushroom is actually fully not dried, if it's like a full mushroom that just comes out of the ground, actually, where these things actually grow is actually underneath pine trees in the wild, actually. And you know who also loves these mushrooms? Reindeer. Reindeer love these mushrooms too. Reindeer just feast on these Amanita mushrooms, and they have their own, what we think is like a psychedelic experience.
I was going to say, are reindeer just walking around just tripping out?
And yeah, I know. And that, you can actually look at the reindeer actually look like they're doing strange things when they're eating the mushrooms, and they love this mushroom. And they'll just eat it. And actually what they used to be able to do is herd reindeer by giving them the mushrooms, like the herders, giving them the mushrooms to follow them around. And so they could actually domesticate the reindeer this way. But it makes you feel like you're flying if you take it. So these shaman would actually dress up looking like the mushroom, red and white, like Santa, it's the whole, and they actually would go in to people's homes in their chimneys because there was so much snow in Siberia that you couldn't get into the door. So you had to go in through the chimney. So all this stuff is really crazy, right? So, but this ibotenic acid is mildly neurotoxic. So it causes this psychedelic experience. It doesn't cause a psychedelic experience like LSD or mushrooms. It's more of kind of like a relaxed kind of maybe some visuals, but nothing as crazy as going on DMT or something like that. But the other ingredient, the Agarin in there, is not psychedelic at all, actually. It actually is an amazing molecule that works on the GABA receptor in our brain.
And this is illegal, completely
legal. Yeah. And so, there's one state in the United States that doesn't allow you to grow or have Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and that's Louisiana for whatever reason. But every other state it's legal, and you can get the Amanita mushroom. But the thing is, if you're getting the mushroom, you're also getting the ibotenic acid, which is neurotoxic. It doesn't. So if you overdose on Amanita, you just get really bad nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. You don't die from this mushroom. Like other mushrooms, if you're foraging, you got to be really careful, right? But the ibotenic acid is the neurotoxic component of it, but the Agarin is completely not neurotoxic and actually supports the GABA system in our brain, and it does it in a profoundly cool way.
There's another term just for people that are watching like that for Agarin that's more commonly talked about or somewhat commonly talked about. It's muscimol?
It's called muscimol. So the other name for Agarin is muscimol.
Got it. So how exactly does Agarin work in terms of cooling you down, parasympathetic activity? I mean, obviously it works on the GABA receptor, but I know there's more to it than that. What's the process there?
Yeah, so the GABA receptor, GABA in our brain is extremely important, right? GABA is our way of calming down our nervous system. It takes about 20% of our neurotransmission is just GABA itself. And GABA is our parasympathetic activation. It helps us rest, relax, digest, recover, detoxify, and things like that. So, and GABA is also these neurons themselves, where they have the GABA receptors, are in these Waylay stations in the brain where there's a lot of what we call sensory gating. So it allows us to process motor and sensory information and integrate all that information. So we have tons of stuff coming at us all the time, all this information, and our body has to, and our brain has to say, like, what's actually important, what's not important, what can we actually attend to, what do we not want to attend to, that kind of thing. And so what these GABA receptors on these GABA neurons can do is help you kind of waylay that and be that sensory gate for memory, for skill acquisition, for learning, all those kinds of things. So the GABA receptor itself is made of 5 subunits, and those subunits change depending on where you are in the brain. Some are more focused on anxiety relief and stress relief. Some will give you more of like visual representations of things. Some will be more sensory gating. But the GABA receptors are everywhere, right?
So what is sensory gating?
So sensory gating means like when we're getting into when you're getting all the sensory information from the environment, you're just feeling, seeing, hearing, touching, you're touching everything you can do. Our brains are trying to process all of that and figure out what's actually important versus what's not actually important.
Thalamic gate.
Yeah, the thalamic gate. There you go. Yeah, the thalamic gate is exactly where there's tons of GABA receptors and GABA neurons.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So the GABA receptor has these 5 subunits that change depending on where they are in the brain. And it has all these different sites on it where things can bind. But the main site, of course, is where GABA binds. It's called the GABA site of the GABA receptor. But then there's all these other sites around on the GABA receptor itself that other things can bind. These are things like kava or magnolia bark or Honokiol, valerian root, or even alcohol, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, quaaludes. These all bind to other sites on the GABA receptor. But what's different about Agarin is that it binds exactly to where GABA would bind on the GABA receptor, which is very, very rare for plants and other kinds of fungus in the air, like that are available.
Why do I feel like garbage when I have valerian root?
So valerian root, first of all, it smells like that's why number one reason people don't like it. The second reason is that it binds to the benzodiazepine receptor on the GABA receptor. So what happens is they're called allosteric modulators. So you have these compounds like valerian, like kava, like Honokiol, for example, which is from magnolia bark, that bind to these sites on the GABA receptor, but not where GABA would bind. That's what the Agarin's doing. But when they bind to these allosteric sites, they're called positive allosteric modulators. And what that means is that they increase the affinity for GABA to bind to the receptor. So when GABA binds to the receptor, the receptor opens, and then what happens is that the neuron that receptor's in stops firing. So that's why we call GABA an inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? So it prevents the firing of a postsynaptic neuron. Okay. So, but what happens with something like valerian's pretty strong for some people and can bind almost as tightly for some people as a benzodiazepine would. And so as a result of that, people might feel very good when they take valerian, but they also may have a crash after they take it, or feel like they're just...
I rebound, get like hyper anxious,
Yeah. And so what happens with long-term use of things like valerian, even kava or Honokiol, even things that are non-pharmaceutical, is that what happens to the receptor, because you're continuing to make more GABA bind to that receptor, that you're actually depleting GABA over time. And also you're down-regulating how many of those receptors that you can bind GABA are there. So that's dangerous, because if there's less receptors available, then you have a tolerance effect. So the people that are having kava all the time, for example, they'll know that they have to get more and more to get the same effect. Same thing with valerian and Honokiol if you're not careful. It's much more significant with pharmaceutical drugs like your benzos, for example. So people know this, or alcohol, right? So if people drink alcohol all the time, they know that their tolerance will go up, and that's because they're depleting GABA and they're decreasing the number of GABA receptors. But the cool thing about Agarin is that it has the capacity to prevent you from depleting your GABA while you're taking something that might allosterically bind to the receptor. So like, for example, you can take something like Honokiol, which is from magnolia bark, which binds to one of these allosteric sites. And at the same time, you can take the Agarin. And as a result of that, you're not going to downregulate the receptor. You're not going to deplete GABA, because when you deplete GABA, that's a bad thing. That's when you get hyper irritable, like you were talking about, because you have too much of the opposite neurotransmitter, which is called glutamate, which is like your excitatory neurotransmitter. And also, as a result of depleting GABA, you have more stress, you have more anxiety, you have harder time sleeping, you have more depression, and all those things. So
it's interesting. So is it when you downregulate GABA altogether, does it change your baseline too, not just your tolerance?
It will, yeah. And so when you downregulate the receptor, you need more GABA available to get the same effect. And that's why you have to get more of the drug in this case to bind more, so you get more GABA. It's like when you're insulin resistant, right? Yeah. You have to have more sugar. More insulin in this case to get the sugar to go into the cells the same way as it would be in the case of a GABA receptor that's being downregulated, because you're downregulating the receptor due to this challenge of giving too much to the system.
Got it. And I want to go into the details of like pragmatic application of this, like how people can use it. Before I get into that, I mean, it's worth noting you have a product at Troscriptions that utilizes Agarin, which is something that I've used for quite a while, and it's pretty powerful that you kind of explain it. And then that way people can check it out. I'll put a link down below for it as well, because it's pretty awesome. It's called Troz. And you know, I want to ask more questions on this and kind of get into it, but I know people probably always want to just like, okay, well, where can I get it? What can I do? And after today's video, I put a link down below for Troscriptions, which is a pretty interesting troche delivery with a particular compound they call Troz. So it's a unique blend of different compounds that help you fall asleep and help you stay asleep. And we're going to get into the neuroscience. We're going to get into some of the actual neurotransmitter function and how this works with Dr. Scott Sherr later in this episode. But in the interim, there is a link down below for you to check out Troscriptions. They have a number of different products ranging from TroCalm, which is something to help you kind of relax and ease down. Then they also have their Troz plus a number of other products. So that link is down below in the top line of the description, just underneath this video. The particular compound is really interesting as well. It has a small dose of melatonin, although it also has something called Agarin, which comes from a mushroom, really unique compound. And this is going to be what helps you sort of stay asleep and not pop out of that sleep. We all wake up at kind of 2 or 3 a.m., so really interesting. And additionally, it also has adenosine, which is what creates sleep pressure. People have heard of adenosine triphosphate, but adenosine is what kind of gives us that pressure to fall asleep. So if you were to go out and run 10 miles, you'd build up this sleep pressure. So really unique in that it helps you fall asleep in a different way from other sleep compounds, plus a unique delivery system that you actually put up into your gums so it absorbs fast. So really interesting stuff. So again, down below, and we'll talk about the science of it later in this episode.
Yeah, but we love this compound, right? So the first product we've used it in is something called Troz, as you said. And Troz has the Agarin in there, but it also has the Honokiol in there as well. So this is called an obligate pair, which we've actually designed in our ecosystem. This is new. Nobody knows about this yet. So an obligate pair is when you have something that binds it to that allosteric site outside of where GABA would bind on the receptor, and you have something that's binding to the GABA receptor where GABA would bind, and that is, in this case, Agarin. So that combination is very, very powerful. And the cool thing about Agarin is that it's very long acting. So it's like 6.5, 7 hours half-life. So you can use it for sleep very, very easily. So we also have other ingredients in Troz that help augment your sleep patterns, including a little bit of 5-HTP, a little bit of melatonin actually as well, which is really great for people, especially if they're traveling. But Troz has a very small amount of it overall. So, but the heavy hitters in the formula really are the Agarin and the Honokiol. We also have a little bit of adenosine in there, which I know you and I have talked about before, along with something called cordycepin, which is from another mushroom, a zombie-fying mushroom that takes over the ants and makes them zombies. But that's a different story for a different day. But that actually increases deep sleep by working on the adenosine system as well. But the key to that formula is that it relaxes you, and it does that by modulating the GABA system in an obligate way, binding to the GABA receptor allosterically with Honokiol, and on the actual site where GABA would bind with the Agarin itself.
And it hits fast. That's what I like about it. Like, because it's in a troche form, so you just kind of stick it in your gum. And
right up here.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, realistically, I've had it hit me as little as 10 minutes. I mean, it's just like, and the adenosine creates this feeling where you're like, I'm ready to go to sleep. But then one of the things that I appreciate about the most is being able to wake up and go back to sleep.
That's the thing. And that's where the Agarin comes in, right? Because once you have a long-acting GABA agonist, it's called, like a long-acting GABA that's kind of regulating you, so that if you have these, everybody has a mild wake up after about 90 minutes of sleep. Typically, that's like the typical sleep cycle. Some people have a more significant wake up around that time, and some people don't. But if you're more awake and then you have like something that all of a sudden you remember you have to do something, then your mind goes up and your cortisol spikes, or you're in the middle of a dream and you're like running away from an animal or something like that, and then you have some of your catecholamines, your norepinephrine and epinephrine kind of driving. You can wake up, but if you have enough GABA around, usually you don't wake up. If you do, you can typically go back to bed because you're not as hyper responsive, not as like stimulated as you would have otherwise. So
totally.
Yeah. And the nice thing about Agarin, as I mentioned, is that the half-life is long. So it's about 6.5 hours. So, and you can actually mess or play around with the dosing is a better way to say it. So like in Troz, we just have 1 milligram in a full troche. And like the average dose of the troche for most of the people that take it is about a half overall. This is a very, very small amount. And actually, we're looking at other products down our pipeline that are using this particular compound for other reasons as well, because of how powerful it is.
No, that's awesome. And well, and there's a link down below. I'll put it in the top link in the description underneath this video if people want to check it out, because it's
a fantastic.
I'll honestly say, I mean, it's the hands down the best sleep aid I've ever used. But what I want to kind of continue to talk about is independent of, even in a sleep aid form, or independent of even independent of Tro-Z, I'm just curious more on Agarin. Like, what about not taking it at night? Like, are there in isolation? If we're not talking about like in combination with things, like if it's sort of down regulatory, kind of helps me just, or down regulate and get into my parasympathetic. Could there be potential application for this, like in the future, for people that are just high strung, or maybe during workouts, so you're trying to stay calm or things like that?
Yeah, for sure. So we're actually looking at that now. The key also to remember, though, is that if you're upregulating the GABA system, you're going to be more relaxed, you're going to be more tired potentially. So you have to figure out ways of potentially mitigating that fatigue that you might get if you want to be as on as you want to be. But it's an interesting thing, right? So if somebody's like super stressed, right? If they're really hyper stressed and they can't think and their mind's kind of going in 1,000 directions, and you give them a little bit of GABA tone, they're going to think better, right? Yeah. They're going to have better performance as well. So we think about modulating the GABA system already with something called Trocom that we have, which has something called nicotinyl GABA, which is similar to GABA, but and also binds to the GABA site on the GABA receptor. So that's nice because there's a vitamin B3 attached to it, and the B3 gives you mild activation. So we're working on other formulas because if you're taking it during the day, you don't want to feel too tired. And so if we're likely going to give it during the day, we're actually going to be giving much smaller doses of it than we would be at night. So instead of taking like 1 milligram or a half a milligram, you probably take a quarter of a milligram or even less than that. So, and that's very difficult for a lot of companies to be able to do, because it's not a very easy compound or ingredient to find and to source. We actually had to source it from outside the United States, and we had to make it ourselves after working with a number of labs and a number of growers and things like that. So as always happens at our company, we have to go to the ends of the earth because we have a crazy mad scientist that works and does all our pioneering pharmacology and formulation. This is Dr. Ted Achacoso, and he works in his kitchen lab in his house in DC. And then we're always trying different things and then sending them to people like you after we try them internally first before that. And when we work on,
I'm always down to be a guinea pig.
Yeah, I know. And look, we're all docs too, as you know. So there's 4 docs. Like, I'm a physician, so we're always making sure that everything's safe, everything's going to be clinically relevant and clean as well before we bring it out to anybody. So
what about potential like co-ingestion with caffeine? Like, does caffeine affect the GABA system at all, or is it?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah. So what caffeine does,
kind of counteract it.
It could. What caffeine does is it actually desensitizes your GABA system. So you don't have as much GABA tone for the amount of GABA that you have there, because GABA is just desensitized when you drink more caffeine. So if you drink a lot of caffeine over long periods of time, you can do the very similar things as we were talking about for like benzos and kava and things like that. You can downregulate your receptors as well. So
interesting.
Yeah, but that's any stimulant. That's any stimulant at all. So it could be like your guanas, your caffeine, your anything like your Adderalls or things like that people are taking. You're going to downregulate your GABA receptors over time.
I did not know this. So some of the irritability that might come with caffeine withdrawal isn't just because you need your energy. It's actually potentially that.
It is. So if you're getting irritable in general, it's usually because you have an overabundance of glutamate versus GABA, because irritability is almost always glutamate.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, because you have this balance, right? So glutamate in the brain gets converted into GABA. And if you're able to convert, great. But if you have too much of an imbalance of the glutamate on top of GABA, you're going to get the irritability, you get the tremors, get like feeling unstable in your own skin, right? But then it's very rare to have too much GABA, but unless you're taking something that's increasing GABA. But that's when you have the opposite effect of that, right? So instead of having insomnia, you sleep like a baby. Instead of having depression, your mood is stable. Instead of having anxiety, you're like, I can roll with this, right? Because you have that stable balance.
That's interesting. Yeah, I had no idea that played such a role in there.
It's 80% of your neurotransmission actually is glutamate and GABA together. So we think about serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine, like all our superstar neurotransmitters, but that's 20% of what's going on.
While we're talking about serotonin for just a second, I want to just pivot for just a minute. What you mentioned 5-HTP. A lot of people have questions on this. I find like if I take, personally, I'm a hyper responder to it. 2 questions. One, does 5-HTP cross the blood-brain barrier, or is it more systemic? Mm-hmm. 2, like, why would someone be a hyper responder? And like, if I take a standard, like, usually if you go to a supplement store, you're going to get 5-HTP, it's going to be like 100 milligrams. Mm-hmm. 100 milligrams will make me feel like I am so apathetic that like a train could like drive in front of me and I just, I just don't care. And like the drive's hard to work out. Like so like I end up usually like cutting little chunks of it or something.
Well, people that take SSRIs feel very similar to that, don't they? Right. So that they have a lot of apathy. They have a lot of less motivation and they can't get erections. These are all related to the serotonin overdrive, basically. So the thing about serotonin is that 95 or even maybe 99% of the serotonin that we make is not even made in our brain, it's made in our gut. So that's number one. So people have to realize that some people have a lot more serotonin in their gut than others, but in general, that'll also modulate or have a factor in how sensitive somebody is to taking serotonin. Because we also have neurons in our gut, right? So if you have serotonergic neurons in your gut, that also, because of the connection, can make you feel sleepy in your brain as well. Yeah. So for example, I'm very similar to you, but I have a lot of serotonin in my gut and you can test this kind of thing. And so if I take just a little bit, I get the same way as you. I get extremely tired. I get apathetic. But the nice thing about most people, so your question about whether it can get across the blood-brain barrier, it absolutely can. So 5-HTP is a kind of a precursor to serotonin, right? So it gets converted into serotonin. You need to have the conversion cofactors to be able to do that, but most people have an easy time to do that. Now, there are some people that are 5-HTP resistant as well. This has actually happened in some more of like the infectious conditions that are happening around now. Like people have an issue with a transporter in their stomach that can't get into the 5-HTP but you can overdrive that in various ways with tryptophan and things like that. But that's another story. But in general, it can go across the blood-brain barrier. And what's nice about serotonin is that it helps with sleep maintenance as well. And so you don't want to have it. You don't have like a lot of it. In Troz, there's only 50 milligrams, 50. So
is that in a whole troche?
It's in a whole troche. It's in a whole troche.
Okay. So if you're taking a quarter of it, you're taking a fraction of it.
12.5. Okay, you're just not taking a lot, right? So our idea with all the things that we do at Troscriptions, as you know, is like low dose synergy with everything. Instead of like hammering you with just one product of one ingredient, it's like, how can you synergize with lower doses of everything? Sure. And as a result of that, you don't build up tolerance, you don't build up withdrawal, you don't have any rebound when you stop taking it. So that's the beauty of the things that we do. And a little bit of 5-HTP and a little melatonin can go a long way in people as well. So, and that's what we found.
No, I mean, I do appreciate that's what you guys do. Because I mean, it's anyone that's listening, or watching, like, by all means, like, you could piecemeal all these different things together.
Totally.
Like, and that's the point. And there's going to be biohackers that want to do that. And like the purpose of like, the reason I do interviews with you is because, yes, like it's information. People can absolutely take what you want from it. This is not designed to be an infomercial where it ultimately comes back. The point is that you're like me and you're a guinea pig and you're an experimenter and like you work on these synergistic things. So that's awesome. And I personally appreciate that because I don't have the time to like combine lots of separate stuff. Yeah. Although I would like to, because I like to play chemist sometimes, but it
sounds like you do at home. You were telling me before. So but what it comes down to, I think it's like the universal thing here with the Agarin is that it's a parasympathetic activator, right? And so as a result of being parasympathetic activating, what do you do when you're parasympathetic? You rest, you recover, you digest, you detox, right? So and more of us need that in our life. More of us need to shut off. We're always on in the world that we live in. The hustle is real. Shutting off, and Agarin's a good way to do that.
Yeah. And I want one more note on the 5-HTP. I know people have said that it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. My answer to that is, I mean, anecdotally, I cannot explain.
It does.
But it does. I mean, because yes, I feel the systemic effect, but it's doing something in my brain. I've taken it enough.
And part of it could be that the gut-brain connection, right? So that the gut microbiota brain connection. So it may not be always happening directly in the brain, but it may actually happen in your gut. And as a result of the signaling that's happening in your gut, you're causing the same kind of signals in the brain too. So that's also possible.
And another thing I know we've talked about in other videos, and we don't need to go into a lot of detail, but just for people that maybe have hit this, this video from different angles is, I think everyone probably benefit from a little supplementation of glutamine if they're training hard and stuff as well to kind of support that GABA system and any like potential influence that you're bringing in through other compounds, whether it's Troscriptions or anything really.
Yeah.
I think being able to support that system with a little bit of glutamine supplementation, like probably just 2 to 5 grams, something simple like that.
That's quite common. So glutamine is what gets converted into glutamate in the brain, and glutamate gets converted into GABA. So you need a good source of glutamine to be able to do that. You also need minerals like you need like magnesium and vitamin B6. They're really, really important. And if you have those cofactors, you'll be able to convert the glutamine to glutamate and to glutamate into GABA very well. Just don't get rid of your GABA too quickly. Try to relax and do breath work and try to get some exercise. Exercise actually helps with that balance too. And BDNF, which actually increases GABA in the brain too. So, and there's many things that you can work on that enhance the GABA system, but you can do a lot of this naturally without any compounds, and that's important too, for sure.
Yeah, sort of my sleep stack is, and I'm being very candid. I don't take Trozy every night. Of
course.
Every night I do take usually theanine, tryptophan, maybe 12.5 5-HTP.
Okay.
And then maybe every third night or so, I'll take Trozy. So that's kind of like my routine, because I find like I do need that extra sleep drive on some days, especially if I'm pushing it really hard.
Yeah.
And then another one that I've recently added in that I talked to you offline about is that Rutaecarpine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Really, I'm really new with it, but it's really interesting. So, note that for maybe future compounds.
My team's actually at the supply side right now, and we're looking for some. So
I guess supply side West is coming. Rutaecarpine. So far I've tried it. I've tried it twice, and I've tried it on days where I've had caffeine past 11.
Nice.
Because there's that new study that just came out a couple weeks ago that was like basically caffeine. Even if you have caffeine at 9 a.m., it's absolutely affecting your sleep, and it's like pretty wild to see that. So I'm like, okay, on days I have caffeine past like 11 a.m. Trying Rutaecarpine.
Interesting. Okay.
It's effective. It works. It definitely, you're supposed to take it, give it about 3 hours to upregulate CYP1A2 and CYP2E1, I think.
Nice. I mean, that's why we have adenosine in Trozy too, because adenosine competes. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptor. And so if you can outcompete the caffeine with more adenosine is extremely short acting if you take it as a supplement orally. But if you can just get it enough to break off any of the caffeine that's causing the blockage, you can also increase sleep drive that way. But that's a really cool compound. I'm excited for that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what longer term activation of CYP1A2 would do. Like, do you down? I don't. You may or may not know either. Like, do you downregulate anything in the liver eventually that makes it harder to metabolize caffeine? It might make it last longer.
You always worry about
no free rides.
There's no free rides. Like, there's always collateral things that are happening, right? So you always have to think about that too. So, and I'm not sure enough with those receptors, but in general, the way receptors work is that if you're flooding them with something, they're going to downregulate themselves because they want to be not being overburdened by whatever it is. And this is what happens with GABA in our case here. But you have to think about this. That's what the body's amazing at doing, is that it's all these feedback mechanisms that are happening all the time, whether it be hormones or neurotransmitters or our gut microbiota are doing this all the time too, and talking to our cells and talking to our brains. So I believe in I definitely have a healthy respect for the feedback system. So always knowing that, and that's why keeping low dose on stuff and also cycling things is a good idea. So I'm with you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Dr. Scott, where can everyone find you, man?
So go to Troscriptions.com or at Troscriptions on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Scott Sherr, DrScottSherr on Instagram as well. I think that's it.
Thanks, brother.
Good to see you.
See you, man.
All right.